At dawn on a frozen December morning, a county worker noticed tire tracks ending too cleanly near a snow-muted embankment, where frost preserved a still outline beneath bare branches, radios crackling softly as deputies arrived, sensing evidence waiting patiently in the cold, untouched, measured, and unwilling to fade away slowly. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The woman was identified by midday through a driver's license found in a purse several yards away, placed rather than dropped, its contents intact except for cash. Her name was Emily Joanne Harker, age 22, a nursing student home for the holidays in rural north-central Ohio. The date was December 14, 1988, 10 days before Christmas. Snow flurries moved in bands across two-lane roads lined with dormant cornfields and skeletal trees. The sheriff's office logged the scene as suspicious death pending autopsy, and a perimeter was set with orange tape that snapped in the wind. Photographs were taken slowly to preserve scale. Footwear impressions were cast. The county coroner noted no obvious trauma at the scene, only the unnatural stillness of a young woman left where the cold could do its work. Emily had last been seen the previous evening at a small shopping plaza outside Mansfield, a cluster of stores glowing against early darkness. She had purchased wrapping paper and a box of ornaments. The receipt timestamped 6:42 p.m. Witnesses remembered her compact sedan idling briefly near the exit before pulling onto the state route. That was the last confirmed sighting. By the next morning, her car was found abandoned in a church parking lot 3 miles away, locked, keys missing, no signs of forced entry. Inside, investigators documented a neatly folded coat on the passenger seat and a cassette tape paused mid-song, details that would echo through reports for decades. The autopsy, conducted in a cold county facility with files stacked in steel cabinets, determined the cause of death as asphyxiation consistent with manual compression. Time of death was estimated between 8:00 and 10:00 p.m., based on core temperature and lividity patterns affected by the night's cold. There were no defensive injuries, no indication of sexual assault, and no intoxicants in her system. Fingernail scrapings were collected, hair fibers preserved, and clothing sealed in paper bags. In 1988, DNA profiling was in its infancy, but the evidence was cataloged carefully, logged with chain-of-custody forms that would later matter. The investigation began methodically. Deputies canvassed roads leading from the plaza, knocking on doors where porch lights glowed against snow. They documented tire tread patterns, compared them to local vehicles, and collected statements from residents who heard nothing beyond the wind. Emily's family, respected and private, cooperated fully, providing timelines and photographs for missing person flyers that had barely been printed before the body was found. Local newspapers ran restrained headlines, focusing on community vigilance rather than speculation. Church services that Sunday included prayers spoken softly, the name mentioned without elaboration. Early theories centered on opportunity. Emily was known to be cautious. There was no history of risky behavior, no known enemies. Investigators examined whether she had stopped to help someone, a common instinct in rural areas during winter. They reviewed traffic records and gas station logs. A mechanic recalled servicing a similar sedan seen idling with hazard lights on Route 39 that night, but the description was vague. The sheriff requested assistance from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, which brought additional technicians and a portable lab. Fibers recovered from Emily's coat were compared against samples from her car and home, revealing several unknown fibers consistent with a work jacket common in manufacturing plants. By January, As Christmas decorations came down and the ground thawed slightly, leads thinned. A man with a prior assault record was interviewed after a tip placed him near the plaza, but alibi verification through time cards cleared him. Another lead involved a delivery driver who reported seeing a stranded car, yet his route logs placed him miles away. The case file grew thicker, its cover stamped with dates and initials. Detectives reconstructed the timeline repeatedly, tracing Emily's likely route and stops, measuring distances in minutes rather than miles. Each reconstruction ended the same way, with a gap that could not be closed. The winter turned to spring, and the case cooled without being abandoned. Evidence was stored in a climate-controlled room, the boxes labeled in careful handwriting. The sheriff held periodic briefings, reiterating facts and discouraging rumors. For an older audience in the county, men who remembered winters harsher and communities smaller, the case lingered as an unsettling break from routine, a reminder that even familiar roads could conceal harm. Thanksgiving came again that year, with empty chairs noted quietly. In 1992, with advances in forensic science, the state lab revisited the fingernail scrapings, attempting early DNA extraction. The results were inconclusive, yielding partial profiles not suitable for comparison. Still, the effort was logged and the samples were preserved anew. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses, aging alongside the file. One detail gained prominence: a white pickup truck reported by two independent witnesses near the church parking lot that evening. The truck was described as older, with a distinctive dent on the rear quarter panel. Registration searches at the time produced hundreds of possibilities. Years passed. The case was transferred to a cold case unit in the early 2000s, when digitization allowed files to be scanned and indexed. Emily's name appeared in a database alongside unsolved homicides statewide. A retired detective, familiar with rural patterns, noted similarities with another case from 1987 involving an abandoned vehicle near a church. That case, too, involved a young woman and a white pickup, but jurisdictional boundaries had kept the files apart. With renewed permission, records were compared. The comparison revealed overlapping names among persons of interest, including a factory maintenance worker named Thomas Reed, then in his 30s, employed at a plant that produced work jackets matching the unknown fibers. Reed had owned a white pickup in the late 1980s, documented in insurance records. He had been questioned briefly in the earlier case and released. In Emily's case, he had never been interviewed. Reed had since moved counties, accrued minor offenses, and lived quietly. In 2018, with modern DNA techniques available, the cold case unit petitioned to test preserved evidence using touch DNA analysis. The fingernail scrapings yielded a usable profile. A search through CODIS produced no immediate match, but investigators pursued genetic genealogy through a lawful partnership, uploading the profile to a public database with consent parameters observed. Months later, a distant familial match emerged, pointing toward a lineage in Ohio. Traditional genealogical research narrowed candidates based on age, location, and access to vehicles. Thomas Reed resurfaced as a statistically significant possibility. Surveillance was conducted discreetly. A discarded coffee cup was retrieved from a public trash receptacle Reed used during a courthouse visit unrelated to the case. The DNA matched the profile from Emily's fingernails. Investigators corroborated the match with fiber analysis, now refined, linking Reed's former work jackets to fibers preserved from the scene. Phone records from 1988, obtained through archived billing statements, placed Reed's line inactive during the critical window, consistent with his being away from home. An arrest warrant was issued in November 2020, just before Thanksgiving. Reed was taken into custody without incident on a gray morning. The community reacted with measured shock, the name unfamiliar to many but the relief tangible. Court proceedings unfolded methodically. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, timeline reconstruction, and expert testimony on DNA transfer. The defense challenged memory and time, but the physical evidence held. In March 2022, Reed was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. In the quiet aftermath, Emily Harker's family attended a small memorial near the Embankment, now cleared and unremarkable. The road carried on. Files were closed and returned to shelves, stamped solved. For those who remembered the winter of 1988, the resolution arrived without spectacle, a lawful conclusion grounded in patience and preserved evidence, allowing a community to finally place the past where it belonged. The winter that followed the discovery settled into routine without comfort, and investigators learned quickly that persistence would matter more than urgency. Evidence logs were audited again, signatures checked, temperatures recorded, and photographs compared against diagrams. The embankment where Emily Joanne Harker had been found was revisited after snowmelt to understand sightlines and traffic flow, not to search anew, but to verify assumptions made under frost and pressure. Measurements were adjusted, distances recalculated, and a clearer picture emerged of how briefly a vehicle could stop there without notice. That understanding shaped interviews conducted years later, when memories had softened and details required careful prompting anchored to dates, receipts, and weather records rather than emotion. The community adjusted outwardly. Christmas returned with lights and pageants, Thanksgiving with measured gratitude, New Year's with resolutions spoken more quietly. For men who had lived decades along those roads, the case remained a point of reference, a reminder cited when teaching grandchildren about caution and winter driving. Local press maintained restraint, marking anniversaries with factual summaries and requests for information that yielded little. The sheriff's office rotated personnel, but the file endured, its thickness growing as technology advanced. Each edition was logged with the same seriousness as the first, because any later courtroom would demand it. When the cold case unit formed, its mandate was not speed but integrity. Detectives reviewed the entire record as if encountering it for the first time, flagging assumptions and separating fact from inference. They reconstructed Emily's last day with precision, aligning class schedules, phone records, and the timing of her purchases. They examined the church parking lot where her car was found, noting its proximity to a county highway and the absence of surveillance cameras in 1988. They consulted retired patrolmen who recalled that night's weather, the way wind had scoured snow from exposed asphalt, preserving some impressions while erasing others. Attention returned to the white pickup reports not because they were dramatic, but because they were consistent. Two witnesses, unknown to each other, had described the same dent and the same timing. Registration databases had been crude in the late 1980s, but insurance archives and employment records offered another route. The maintenance plant near Mansfield kept detailed logs for safety compliance, including uniform issue records. Those records confirmed the distribution of heavy work jackets, with a fiber blend matching samples preserved from Emily's clothing. That correlation did not prove contact, but it narrowed a field that had once been overwhelming. Thomas Reed's name appeared in margins before it appeared on warrants. He fit parameters without fitting a profile which mattered. He had no history of violence recorded at the time, lived alone, worked irregular shifts, and owned a truck matching witness descriptions. He had been in the area on nights similar to the one in question. When investigators sought to interview him decades later, they did so without theatrics. Reed answered questions politely, denied knowledge, and provided a general account of his life that aligned with records. There was nothing to arrest on then, and procedure required restraint. The turning point came with science applied patiently. Touch DNA analysis, unavailable in 1988, was conducted under strict contamination controls. Lab technicians documented each step, wearing protective gear and photographing seals before opening evidence bags last handled decades earlier. The resulting profile was partial but sufficient. When direct database searches failed, the lawful use of genetic genealogy required approvals, transparency, and limits. Analysts built family trees backward from distant matches, using public records and obituaries, mapping migrations across Ohio counties. Each branch was pruned carefully, ensuring no leap exceeded what evidence could support. When Reed emerged as a candidate, corroboration became the focus. Investigators sought independent links. Vehicle ownership records confirmed the pickup's dent repaired in the early 1990s. Employment logs placed Reed off duty the night Emily disappeared. A former coworker, interviewed years later, recalled Reed's jacket stained from a recent repair job, a mundane detail at the time, recorded without embellishment. None of this alone established guilt, but together they justified further steps. The collection of a discarded item for DNA comparison followed established legal standards. Surveillance ensured the item was abandoned voluntarily in a public place. The match, when confirmed, was documented in a report reviewed by supervisors and prosecutors. A warrant application detailed the science in plain language, anticipating scrutiny. The arrest, carried out just before Thanksgiving, was quiet by design. Reed was informed of the charge, transported without incident, and booked according to protocol. News broke after confirmation, framed by facts rather than speculation. Pretrial proceedings extended through winter. Motions addressed the admissibility of genetic genealogy, chain of custody, and expert testimony. Each was argued with reference to precedent and statute. The court ruled evidence admissible, noting the care taken to respect privacy and procedure. During trial, the prosecution avoided narrative excess, presenting timelines, lab results, and maps. Jurors were guided through the science step by step. The defense emphasized the passage of time and the absence of eyewitnesses, but could not dislodge the physical links. The verdict arrived without spectacle. Sentencing followed established guidelines. In statements read into the record, Emily's life was described in measured terms, her plans and routines outlined without dramatization. The judge acknowledged the patience required to reach resolution and the limits of any sentence to restore what was lost. Reed was remanded to state custody. Appeals were noted and later denied, their arguments addressed in written opinions that cited the thoroughness of the investigation. Afterward, the file was closed formally. Evidence was retained per statute, summaries updated, and notifications sent. The embankment returned to anonymity. For those who had waited, the end came not as release but as alignment, facts finally matching outcome. The seasons continued. Christmas lights reflected off snowbanks again, and a quiet certainty replaced years of unanswered questions. The years after the conviction unfolded without headlines, yet the case continued to influence how local agencies approached unresolved deaths from earlier decades. Training sessions referenced the methodical preservation of evidence from Emily Harker's file, emphasizing that nothing collected in winter should be dismissed as routine or temporary. Younger investigators learned that patience was not passive, that waiting for science to mature was sometimes the most active decision available. The Cold Case Unit documented its process in a final report intended for internal use, detailing not triumph but sequence, an account meant to be read by those who would inherit similar responsibilities. Community memory adjusted slowly. In Mansfield and the surrounding townships, the name Emily Harker shifted from question to history. Older residents, men who measured time in harvests and winters, spoke of the case with a steadier tone, less burdened by uncertainty. They remembered where they had been that December night, the roads they had driven, the radios they had listened to while snow pressed against the windows. Closure did not erase those memories, but it reframed them, allowing recollection without the tension of not knowing. The courthouse records, once active with filings, settled into their final state. Transcripts were archived, exhibits cataloged, and the appellate decision bound with the original judgment. Law clerks noted the case for its clear chain of custody and careful handling of emerging forensic tools. In legal circles, it became an example cited when discussing the responsible use of genetic genealogy, a reminder that innovation required restraint as much as capability. The decision outlined standards that would guide future cases, emphasizing warrants, consent, and corroboration. For Emily's family, the resolution arrived quietly. They declined interviews, choosing instead to mark time privately. Holidays remained complicated, but no longer defined by unanswered questions. A small scholarship in Emily's name was established at a local nursing program, funded modestly, intended to support students returning home for winter breaks. It was not announced with ceremony. It appeared in a bulletin, then persisted year to year, a practical remembrance aligned with the life interrupted. The physical places tied to the investigation changed subtly. The shopping plaza updated its storefronts. The church parking lot was resurfaced. The embankment grew thicker with brush, obscuring the spot where evidence once lay preserved by frost. Roads were widened, signage improved, and traffic increased. Yet the rural character remained, the sense that winter could still quiet everything to a standstill. Investigators who revisited the area years later did so as a matter of record, photographing updates to close loops in the file, ensuring that future readers would understand the geography as it had been. Within the sheriff's office, personnel who had worked the case retired. Their notes, written in block letters on lined paper, were scanned and indexed. New deputies learned the story not as legend but as instruction. They were taught to document weather, to note the placement of personal items, to treat early assumptions as provisional. The emphasis was on process over intuition, on preserving options for the future. The lesson was not that every case would be solved, but that every case deserved preparation for that possibility. Thomas Reed's incarceration followed the routine of the state system. Intake assessments, classification, and placement proceeded according to policy. His appeals exhausted, his name receded from public discussion. There were no further charges connected to him, no pattern uncovered beyond what had already been proven. The narrative remained narrow by design, focused on what evidence established rather than what speculation might suggest. The restraint mattered, ensuring that the case ended where proof ended. Media coverage reflected that restraint. Anniversary articles shifted from appeals for tips to summaries of resolution, then faded. The local paper archived its reporting, accessible to subscribers who searched by date. Radio stations referenced the case occasionally when discussing advances in forensic science, noting how long evidence could wait if preserved correctly. There was no dramatization, no reenactments, only acknowledgement that time and care had converged. As decades passed, the case entered a different phase of existence, less immediate but more instructive. Academic programs in criminal justice requested anonymized materials for study, granted under agreements that protected privacy. Students examined the timeline, the gaps, and the eventual connections, learning how absence of evidence in one era could become presence in another. The emphasis remained on ethics and legality, on ensuring that the pursuit of resolution did not outrun rights. The seasons continued their reliable cycle. Thanksgiving brought early darkness and travel advisories. Christmas lights reflected off snowbanks. New Year's mornings arrived with quiet streets and resolved calendars. In those moments, the story of Emily Harker existed not as spectacle but as a completed record, a reminder of the cost of violence and the value of diligence. For those who had lived through the uncertainty, the knowledge that the file was closed allowed attention to return fully to the present. In the end, the case stood as a testament to procedural endurance. Evidence collected under freezing skis had waited for tools precise enough to read it. Witness memories had been checked against records rather than trusted alone. Legal standards had guided each step, ensuring that the outcome could withstand scrutiny. The quiet aftermath was appropriate, a measured conclusion to a winter crime that had lingered across many winters before yielding its truth. As the case receded from active attention, its documentation took on a different purpose, serving as a reference for how investigations could persist beyond the careers of those who began them. The county archive stored the physical files in temperature-controlled rooms, alongside decades of other records that chronicled accidents, disputes, and lives intersecting briefly with law enforcement. Emily Harker's file was thicker than most, not because of excess, but because nothing had been discarded. Every form, every photograph, every memo had been retained, reflecting a philosophy shaped by earlier generations who understood that certainty often arrived late. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation incorporated the case into its internal training materials, emphasizing how early decisions had preserved later options. Instructors pointed to the choice to collect fingernail scrapings even when technology could not yet read them, to the labeling practices that prevented contamination, and to the patience shown when leads failed. For officers nearing retirement, the case validated habits formed long before digital tools, habits rooted in handwriting clarity and evidence discipline. For younger recruits, it illustrated continuity between eras rather than a sharp divide. Public understanding matured in parallel. Community meetings held years later addressed broader safety concerns, and the case was mentioned only as context, a reminder of why procedures mattered. There was no appetite for revisiting pain, only for ensuring competence. Local leaders spoke of trust earned through transparency, noting that updates had been factual and limited even when pressure existed to speculate. That restraint had protected the integrity of the eventual prosecution, an outcome acknowledged quietly rather than celebrated. The role of weather, so central at the beginning, became a teaching point as well. Winter had preserved evidence but also delayed discovery. Investigators documented how frost could both reveal and conceal, how tire impressions hardened overnight, and how cold affected estimates of time. Those lessons informed protocols for future winter scenes, prompting investments in equipment and training suited to rural Ohio's climate. The embankment itself, once a focal point, was now only a line on a map, but its lessons endured. In legal analysis, the case contributed to evolving standards around genetic genealogy. The court's written opinions were studied for their careful language, balancing investigative need with privacy rights. They underscored that such tools were not shortcuts but supplements, requiring corroboration and warrants. That clarity influenced policy statewide, shaping guidelines that would govern future cold casework. The emphasis remained on verifiability, ensuring that outcomes could be defended years later. Emily Harker's name appeared less often in print as time passed, but it did not disappear entirely. The scholarship bearing her name supported students quietly, and each award cycle included a brief description of her aspiration to care for others. Recipients were not asked to speak publicly. The support was practical, aligned with the family's wishes. In this way, remembrance avoided spectacle, favoring continuity over commemoration. For investigators who had labored over the file, the end brought a complex mix of relief and sobriety. Closure did not erase the weight of responsibility felt when confronting a life cut short. Instead, it affirmed that diligence mattered even when results were not immediate. Some retired officers kept copies of certain reports, not as souvenirs, but as reminders of why they had chosen the work. They spoke of the case to peers with a tone that conveyed respect rather than pride. The broader cultural landscape shifted as well. True crime media expanded nationally, often favoring dramatization, but local coverage of Emily's case remained restrained. Editors resisted reenactments and speculation, citing the value of accuracy. This approach preserved the dignity of those involved and reinforced trust between the press and the community. It also ensured that future readers encountering the story would receive a clear account grounded in record rather than narrative flourish. As infrastructure changed, the physical context of the crime continued to evolve. New developments appeared along the highway, and traffic patterns altered. Yet the essential character of the area persisted, shaped by seasons and routine. Investigators noted these changes in supplemental reports, closing the loop on how the scene had transformed. This attention to detail reflected an understanding that context mattered not only at discovery, but in historical interpretation. Within the correctional system, Reed's case followed established rhythms. Reviews occurred at scheduled intervals, each referencing the conviction and the evidence supporting it. There were no surprises, no revelations that altered the established facts. The process was procedural, reflecting a system designed to administer outcomes rather than revisit settled conclusions absent new information. The stability of that process contrasted with the uncertainty that had once surrounded the case. Looking back, the investigation illustrated how multiple disciplines converged over time. Patrol work, forensic science, legal analysis, and community cooperation each played roles, none sufficient alone. The case demonstrated that resolution could be cumulative, built from increments preserved across years. This understanding informed how agencies allocated resources, recognizing that cold cases required stewardship as much as active pursuit. As another decade approached, the file remained accessible but dormant, its status unchanged. Periodic audits confirmed compliance with retention policies. Digital backups ensured redundancy. The case no longer demanded attention, yet it remained present as a completed chapter within a larger institutional memory. That balance between closure and availability reflected maturity in record-keeping. In the quiet of winter mornings, when snow again muted sound along rural roads, the story existed only in memory and archive. It no longer pressed for answers. Instead, it stood as an example of how patience, restraint, and methodical care could eventually align truth with record. For those who remembered the uncertainty of 1988, that alignment offered a measure of peace grounded not in emotion, but in fact. The final years after resolution unfolded without disturbance, marked by ordinary cycles that contrasted sharply with the long uncertainty that had preceded them. Winter still arrived early in north-central Ohio, bringing muted roads and early dusk, but the season no longer carried unresolved weight. The case of Emily Joanne Harker had transitioned fully into record, its outcome stable, its documentation complete. What remained was the quiet influence it exerted on institutions and individuals who had carried it for decades. Within the sheriff's office, policy revisions reflected lessons learned. Evidence retention schedules were reaffirmed, and additional funding was allocated to climate-controlled storage. Deputies were reminded that winter scenes demanded patience, that haste in cold conditions could damage what time might later reveal. These were not abstract principles, but practices shaped by experience, reinforced through a case that had tested them over years rather than weeks. The culture emphasized continuity, ensuring that transitions in leadership would not disrupt stewardship of unresolved files. The courthouse maintained its steady rhythm. Clerks processed routine filings, judges presided over calendars filled with contemporary matters, and the records of Emily's case rested among thousands of others. When accessed, they told a complete story from initial report to final appellate denial, each step traceable. That completeness mattered, not for sentiment but for accountability. It ensured that the outcome could be reviewed, understood, and defended without reliance on memory alone. Academic interest in the case persisted modestly. Seminars on cold case methodology referenced it as an illustration of incremental progress. Students examined how early investigative discipline had enabled later breakthroughs, and how restraint had preserved legitimacy. The case underscored that justice delayed was not justice denied when delay was accompanied by care. This framing resonated with audiences accustomed to instant results, offering a counterexample grounded in reality. For the community, memory settled into a quieter form. Older residents still recalled the winter of 1988, the way snow had fallen unevenly that December, the shock that moved through familiar places. Yet those recollections were no longer tethered to uncertainty. The knowledge of resolution allowed the past to remain in the past, accessible without intruding. Conversations that mentioned the case did so with finality, acknowledging an end rather than reopening a wound. Emily Harker's family continued their private remembrances. They marked anniversaries without public notice, choosing continuity over commemoration. The scholarship bearing her name endured quietly, supporting students who shared her path. Its existence required no explanation beyond its purpose. In this way, her life was honored through practical support rather than narrative retelling. The physical environment reflected the passage of time. Roads were repaved, signage updated, and new buildings appeared where fields once lay dormant. The embankment where Emily had been found was now indistinguishable from others along the route, its significance preserved only in files and memory. Investigators acknowledged this transformation as natural, a reminder that landscapes changed even as records endured. Documentation captured these changes to ensure future readers could reconcile description with present reality. Media treatment of the case concluded with restraint. Final articles summarized outcomes, cited court records, and moved on. There were no retrospectives seeking drama, no anniversary specials revisiting speculation. Editors recognized that the story had reached its proper conclusion. This approach preserved trust and reflected a shared understanding that some stories were complete once facts were established. In correctional records, Thomas Reed's name appeared only as required. His status was stable, his case closed. Reviews proceeded according to schedule, guided by policy rather than emotion. There were no new developments that altered the established narrative. The system functioned as designed, administering a sentence grounded in evidence and affirmed by law. The broader implication of the case lay in its demonstration of institutional memory. Agencies had preserved not only evidence but intention, ensuring that future investigators would understand why decisions had been made. This continuity bridged generations, linking handwritten notes from 1988 to digital files accessed decades later. It illustrated that justice was not a moment but a process extended over time. As winter mornings continued to arrive with frost and quiet, the story existed only when sought. It no longer demanded attention, yet it remained available as an example of diligence rewarded. For men who had lived long enough to see its arc complete, the case affirmed beliefs shaped by experience. That careful work mattered, that patience was not weakness, and that resolution, when it came, should be accepted without spectacle. The file remained accessible but dormant, audited periodically, its status unchanged. That dormancy was itself a sign of success, indicating that no questions remained unanswered within the bounds of evidence. The outcome had been lawful, verifiable, and final. In a system often defined by motion, stillness signified completion. Ultimately, the case of Emily Joanne Harker stood as a testament to procedural endurance. Evidence collected under winter skis had waited for science to catch up. Witness accounts had been tested against records rather than memory alone. Legal standards had guided each step, ensuring legitimacy. The quiet aftermath was appropriate, reflecting a conclusion grounded in fact rather than feeling. In the balance between loss and resolution, the record leaned toward clarity. The past could not be undone, but it had been understood. That understanding allowed institutions to improve, families to grieve without uncertainty, and communities to trust that patience and care could align truth with outcome. As another winter settled over Ohio, the roads grew quiet again, and the story rested where it belonged, complete and undisturbed.